My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 33 years old, and I oversee daily operations for a hospitality company that serves nearly 3,000 guests every week across several busy restaurants. I understand how a dinner check moves from the kitchen printer to a customer's table the same way most people understand how to ride a bicycle. So when my parents contacted me after 3 years of complete silence and invited me to dinner so we could reconnect as a family, there was one question I should have asked before agreeing. Who else is coming? I never asked. Instead, I drove 45 minutes across town to a restaurant called The Meridian, walked through the front entrance, and discovered 15 relatives already gathered around, a massive table overflowing, with king crab legs, premium steaks, and expensive wine that had clearly been flowing long before I arrived. My father looked up from the center seat. He smiled. Then he said something that instantly explained why I had been invited. Good, you're here. You're covering dinner tonight, right? It's the least you can do. He thought he had me trapped. What he didn't know was that 2 quiet sentences I would later say to a waiter were about to change the entire evening. And 15 minutes later, his own credit card would reveal a truth he never expected the family to hear. Welcome back to Heartwarming Tales, where everyday people face difficult family situations and discover their own strength. If you've ever felt pressured to carry responsibilities that never belong to you, this story may feel familiar. But before we get to that dinner, before the crowded table and the enormous bill, I need to tell you who I was when the invitation first arrived. Because my family was counting on an older version of me, a version that no longer existed. I manage restaurants. I don't own them. I worked my way up from the bottom. At 17, I was clearing tables after school. At 19, I was greeting guests. By 21, I was serving customers. At 24, I became an assistant manager. By 30, I was overseeing multiple locations. The journey wasn't glamorous. It was long hours, missed weekends, and countless nights spent solving problems while everyone else was asleep. I'm comfortable financially, but I'm not wealthy. I own a modest condo. I contribute regularly to retirement savings, and I have one small luxury I allow myself. Sparkling water. Every restaurant, every meal, every time. My employees tease me about it. But there's a reason. When you've spent years paying for other people, you learn how to keep your own wants very small. The morning the invitation arrived, I was sitting in my office reviewing supplier agreements when my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Immediately, a familiar heaviness settled in my chest. After 3 years of silence, I had been added back into the family group chat. I stared at the notification for nearly a minute. The chat still carried the same heart emoji my mother had chosen years earlier, back when the group was used for holiday recipes, birthday photos, and family updates. I hadn't seen that little heart in years. My mother's message was warm, careful, almost rehearsed. She wrote that she and Dad had spent a lot of time reflecting. They wanted to reconnect. They wanted us to heal. She invited me to dinner at the Meridian. Just 4 people. Her, Dad, my younger sister Emily, and me. A fresh start. Then another message appeared. Only a few seconds later, one sentence. The same sentence I'd heard most of my life. Family takes care of family, sweetheart. I stared at those words, because in our family, those words had always carried a very specific meaning. Claire takes care of family. When I was 19, it meant helping with utility bills. When I was 23, it meant helping Dad qualify for financing. When Emily needed help moving into her first apartment, it meant quietly covering costs no one else could afford. Family takes care of family. The phrase never seemed to work in both directions. I noticed something else. My mother never said she was sorry. She never admitted anyone had been wrong. She simply said it was time to move forward. I replied with 2 words. I'll come. Then I placed my phone face down and tried to return to work. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling. 3 years earlier, my sister Emily had decided she wanted to open a bakery. Not because she'd spent years studying business. Not because she'd created a detailed plan. She simply fell in love with the idea after visiting a charming cafe during a vacation. She needed a large business loan. The bank was willing to approve it, but only if someone co-signed. That someone was supposed to be me. My parents called me over one Sunday afternoon. Dad already looked irritated before the conversation began. Emily sat beside them, excited about her dream. They asked me to sign. I asked for a business plan. There wasn't one. I asked about projected revenue. No answer. Supplier agreements? Nothing. Lease details? Unclear. Emily looked offended. My mother looked disappointed. Then she said something I'll never forget. You don't need spreadsheets to support your sister. I loved my sister. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that I had spent years watching restaurants succeed and fail. I knew exactly how dangerous debt could become. So for the first time in my life, I said no. The room went silent. Dad stood up, pointed toward the door, and delivered the sentence that changed everything. If you won't support this family, then maybe you're not part of it. I left. No calls, no messages, no holidays, nothing. For 3 years, I was treated like the daughter who cared more about money than family. The truth is, the silence hurt. Not because they were right, because I missed them. I missed being included. I missed feeling useful. And it took years and a wonderful therapist named Dr. Harper to understand why. I had spent most of my life being the fixer, the problem solver, the reliable daughter. Whenever something went wrong, I stepped in. Whenever money was needed, I found it. Whenever there was a crisis, I handled it. Eventually, my family stopped seeing those acts as generosity. They began seeing them as obligations, and I helped create that expectation. Without realizing it, I had trained everyone around me to believe that if they applied enough pressure, I would eventually give in. When I finally stopped, they didn't know how to respond. So they walked away. That's why the invitation felt so confusing. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part of me wanted answers. And part of me simply missed my mother. Not the complicated version. The version who taught me how to bake cornbread when I was little. The version who sang country songs in the kitchen while dinner cooked. Those memories still mattered, even after everything. My friend Rachel warned me not to go. This sounds like a setup, she said immediately. My restaurant manager, Luis, agreed. His advice was even shorter. Don't. But I had already decided. Not because I trusted them, because I needed closure. I wanted to know whether 3 years had changed anything, or whether the same old expectations were waiting beneath a prettier package. So I made one simple rule. One dinner, one conversation, no money, and if things felt wrong, I would leave. I wrote it on a sticky note and placed it on my dashboard. One dinner, then home. That note was still there when I arrived at the Meridian and saw the parking lot full of familiar vehicles. I sat in my car for nearly 2 minutes. The engine was off. My hands rested on the steering wheel, and my eyes kept returning to the sticky note taped beside the speedometer. One dinner, then home. The sensible choice would have been to leave. Drive back to my condo. Heat up leftover soup. Watch television. Forget the entire invitation had ever happened. Instead, I stepped out of the car. I straightened my blouse, locked the door, and walked toward the entrance. Because I had spent the last 3 years learning not to run from uncomfortable conversations. I wasn't about to start now. The Meridian was exactly the kind of place people visited when they wanted to impress someone. Tall glass doors, elegant lighting, fresh flowers in the lobby, the smell of warm bread floating through the air. Everything about it whispered luxury. A hostess dressed in black greeted me with a professional smile. Good evening. Family gathering? I nodded. She checked her screen. Oh, yes. Your party arrived quite a while ago. Quite a while ago. Interesting. She grabbed a menu. Only one menu. Then led me toward the private dining section. Before I could see the table, I could hear it. Laughter. Glasses clinking. My Aunt Susan's unmistakable laugh rising above every other conversation. The closer we got, the tighter my stomach became. Then we rounded the corner, and there they were. Not 4 people. Not even close. 15 relatives. Every chair occupied except one. My chair, at the far end of an enormous table directly across from my father. White linens covered the table. Silverware gleamed beneath soft lighting. Platters filled nearly every available inch of space. King crab legs, premium steaks, imported cheeses, seafood towers, and several bottles of expensive wine. Some nearly empty, others freshly opened. The meal had clearly been underway long before I arrived. The hostess paused, then quietly leaned toward me. Just so you know, your father placed a credit card on file when he made the reservation. We require that for large parties. I nodded. Interesting. Very interesting. Then she offered me a look that every restaurant employee recognizes instantly. A look that translated perfectly. Good luck. My mother spotted me first. She jumped up immediately. Claire! Her arms opened dramatically. Every face at the table turned toward me. Suddenly, everyone was smiling. Everyone was excited. Everyone acted as though no time had passed at all. Several relatives even applauded. Applauded, as if I had returned from a military deployment instead of 3 years of family silence. I forced a polite smile. My aunt dabbed at her eyes. My cousin raised her wine glass. My sister Emily smiled too. But there wasn't much warmth behind it. Just observation, like she was waiting to see how I would react. I sat down because standing there felt even stranger. The moment I touched the chair, a server appeared and poured water into my glass. Years of restaurant management had trained me to notice details automatically. The wine bottles, the empty appetizer plates, the half-finished desserts, the timing. They had been eating for at least an hour, maybe longer. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We wanted to surprise you." I looked around. I thought it was just the four of us. She laughed lightly. "Oh, it started that way." Then she waved her hand dismissively. "But then Susan heard about it, and your cousins wanted to come, and everyone was so excited." I nodded slowly. Of course they were. I scanned the table. My father sat at the head like a king hosting a banquet. Emily sat beside him. My uncles and aunts occupied the center seats. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years filled the remaining spaces. There were even two people I barely recognized. One woman I had never met at all. Yet somehow she was enjoying king crab at what was supposedly a family reconciliation dinner. Mom squeezed my hand again. "Isn't this wonderful?" I smiled politely. Wonderful wasn't the word I would have chosen. The server returned. His name tag read Ethan. He looked young, maybe 20. My father immediately waved him over. "We need another round of steaks." Ethan nodded. "And another bottle of that red wine." Another nod. "And bring whatever dessert sampler is most popular." Of course. Dad pulled his wallet out, removed a credit card, held it up dramatically. "Use this one." Then he tucked it back away. The gesture felt theatrical, almost intentional. Because my father wasn't naturally extravagant, I knew that better than anyone. This was the same man who once drove across town to save $3 on gasoline. The same man who compared prices for weeks before buying a lawnmower. Yet tonight he was ordering like a millionaire. Something didn't add up. The small comments started shortly afterward. Little observations disguised as jokes. Aunt Susan smiled over her wineglass. "It must be nice running all those restaurants." Several people laughed. I smiled politely. Another cousin asked whether I traveled often for work. Someone else asked how much managers earn these days. Then came the comments that felt less innocent. "Claire's always been successful. She's doing much better than the rest of us. Corporate life must pay pretty well." Every sentence sounded casual, but together they painted a picture. A picture of me, the wealthy daughter, the successful sister, the one who didn't need help, the one who certainly had enough money. Emily finally spoke. Without looking up from her phone, she wouldn't know what's been happening here. The table grew quieter. I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "You haven't exactly been around." There it was. The familiar narrative. The one they'd been telling themselves for years. Not that they pushed me away. Not that they cut contact. Just that I left. It was remarkable how easily people rewrote history when it benefited them. My aunt leaned forward sympathetically. "Family shouldn't keep score." I nearly laughed. The irony was overwhelming. Nobody in our family kept score more carefully than the people sitting at this table. I took a sip of sparkling water, the only thing I'd ordered, the only thing I intended to order. Compared to the feast surrounding me, it looked almost comical. 15 relatives enjoying expensive food, and me quietly drinking mineral water. A few minutes later, Ethan passed by my chair. "Can I get you anything else?" His voice was soft, professional, tired. I recognized the look instantly. I'd worn that exact expression at his age. The look of someone managing a difficult table while hoping the night ended peacefully. "Just sparkling water," I said. He nodded, then hesitated. "Are you sure?" I smiled. Very sure. Something in my tone must have communicated more than my words. Because he gave a tiny nod of understanding, then moved on. I watched him weave through the crowded dining room. Fast, efficient, careful. I remembered being exactly like him. Carrying too many plates, working double shifts, counting tips after midnight, trying to build a future one exhausting day at a time. That younger version of me would never have imagined sitting at this table, listening to relatives discuss my finances like a community project, or watching 15 people enjoy a meal they clearly expected someone else to pay for. And deep down, a realization was beginning to form. This dinner wasn't about healing. It wasn't about reconnecting. It wasn't even about family. It was about something else entirely. I just hadn't heard the final request yet. But judging by the smiles around the table, it was coming. For the next 30 minutes, I mostly listened. That was another skill years in hospitality had taught me. People reveal themselves when they're comfortable. And my family looked very comfortable. The wine kept flowing. Fresh platters arrived. Steaks disappeared almost as quickly as Ethan could deliver them. The conversation bounced from vacations to local gossip to stories I hadn't been present for, No one asked about my life in any meaningful way. Nobody asked whether I was happy, whether I was healthy, whether the last 3 years had been difficult. Instead, they talked around me, about me, as though I were a topic instead of a person. Then Uncle Robert leaned back in his chair and smiled. So Claire, the entire table seemed to pause. Not obviously, just enough. Like musicians waiting for a conductor's signal. How's business? There it was. The real conversation beginning. Busy, I answered. He nodded. I hear you're overseeing several locations now. 4. That's impressive. Aunt Susan smiled. You've always been ambitious. I thanked her. Then she added, and successful. The emphasis wasn't subtle. Several relatives exchanged glances. Emily finally looked up from her phone. Claire's always been good with money. Another glance passed around the table. A quiet signal. A shared understanding. I felt something settle into place. Like the final piece of a puzzle. This wasn't a reunion. It was a presentation. And I was the audience. Dad raised his wine glass. To Claire. Everyone lifted theirs. To Claire. I raised my sparkling water. The toast felt strange. Performative. Like actors reading from a script. Dad smiled warmly. Warmer than he'd smiled at me in years. We're proud of you. The words landed harder than they should have. Because some small, foolish part of me had wanted to hear them. For years, maybe my entire life. But timing matters. And compliments offered right before a request rarely come without strings attached. The conversation shifted again. This time toward finances, mortgage rates, car payments, business challenges, unexpected expenses. One relative mentioned medical bills. Another discussed rising grocery costs. Everyone seemed eager to highlight how expensive life had become. Meanwhile, every few minutes, another expensive dish arrived at the table. The contradiction was almost impressive. Then Emily sighed dramatically. The last few years have been rough. Several heads nodded. Mom reached over and squeezed her hand. Dad stared thoughtfully into his wine. The atmosphere changed. Softer, heavier, more emotional. Deliberately so. I recognized the technique immediately. I'd watched customers do the same thing before asking for discounts. Build sympathy first, ask second. Dad finally cleared his throat. You know, here it comes. Family hasn't had it easy. I remained silent. We've all struggled. Another pause. Mom nodded sadly. We've had some difficult times. Interesting. Because nobody had mentioned those difficult times during the 3 years they weren't speaking to me. Aunt Susan sighed. Everyone helps where they can. The table became very quiet. Every instinct I possessed told me we were approaching the real reason for this gathering. Then Dad smiled. A practiced smile. The kind people wear when they think they've set the stage perfectly. I'm glad we're together again. I nodded. So am I. He seemed pleased by that answer. Encouraged. Then he leaned forward. You know, family should support each other. There it was again. That phrase. The family motto. The unofficial contract I'd spent years funding. I took a sip of sparkling water. Dad continued, and maybe this dinner can be a fresh start. A fresh start sounds nice. Mom smiled brightly. It really does. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Emily finally delivered the line they'd all been circling toward. You've always been the successful one. The statement hung in the air, heavy, intentional. I smiled politely. I've worked hard. Exactly. Emily nodded. You've done really well. Another pause. Then Aunt Susan laughed softly. Better than the rest of us. There it was. The setup. The framing. The positioning. Not Claire, the daughter. Not Claire, the sister. Claire, the financially successful relative. The resource. The solution. The wallet. The role I'd played for years. And the role they assumed I'd happily resume. I glanced toward Ethan as he delivered another bottle of wine. Poor kid. He had no idea he was serving dinner at a financial intervention. He placed the bottle carefully, then stepped away. Dad watched him leave, then looked directly at me for the first time all evening. Not around me, not through me, at me. And suddenly I knew. The bill was coming. Not eventually. Soon. Very soon. I could practically see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The confidence. The certainty. The assumption that everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. The funny thing was, I wasn't nervous anymore. Earlier, in the parking lot, I'd been anxious. Inside the restaurant, I'd been cautious. Now, I felt calm. Because once you understand the game, you stop worrying about the rules. The evening continued for another 15 minutes. Desserts arrived. Coffee arrived. The final wine bottle was opened. People laughed louder than before. The mood became almost celebratory, as though some major success had already occurred. Then I noticed something. Dad kept checking his watch. Every few minutes. Subtle, but consistent. Waiting, timing something. And then it happened. The last dessert plate disappeared. The final coffee cups were served. The conversation slowed naturally, and Ethan appeared carrying a black leather check presenter. The moment I'd been expecting. The moment they'd been building toward all night. Ethan approached my father first, exactly as restaurant protocol required. After all, Dad's credit card was the one attached to the reservation. Dad looked at the folder, then at me, then back at the folder, slowly, deliberately, like a performer preparing for the final act. A smile spread across his face. Confident, certain, victorious. He pushed the check presenter across the table, straight toward me, and then, in front of 15 relatives, he said the words everyone had been waiting to hear. Your turn, sweetheart. Around the table, smiles appeared. Nods followed. A few people chuckled. Nobody looked surprised. Not one person. Because they had known all along. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't spontaneous. This had been the plan from the beginning. The invitation. The surprise guests. The expensive food. The endless praise. Every piece carefully arranged to guide me toward this exact moment. The bill sat in front of me, untouched, heavy. I didn't need to open it to know it was enormous. Thousands of dollars, easily. Everyone watched, waiting, expecting, assuming, and as I looked around the table, I realized something remarkable. Not a single person had asked. Not one. They hadn't requested help, hadn't started a conversation, hadn't treated me like family. They had simply decided I would pay. The same way I'd always paid. The same way I'd always fixed things. The same way I'd always kept the peace. Dad leaned back comfortably. Family takes care of family. The room filled with approving smiles. And that's when I finally understood something. They hadn't invited me because they missed me. They invited me because they missed what I used to do for them. What none of them knew was that the woman who used to say yes to everything had stayed home that night. And the woman sitting in front of them was about to make a very different choice. The black check presenter sat in front of me, untouched, heavy, almost symbolic. 16 pairs of eyes watched from around the table, waiting, expecting, certain. My father folded his hands and leaned back comfortably. The expression on his face reminded me of someone standing at the finish line after a race they believed was already won. Family takes care of family, he repeated. Several relatives nodded. Aunt Susan smiled approvingly. Emily took another sip of wine. No one looked concerned. No one looked uncertain. Because in their minds, there was no decision to make. The outcome had already been decided before I walked through the restaurant doors. For years, that assumption would have been correct. I would have smiled, pulled out my card, covered the bill, then driven home wondering why I felt exhausted and invisible. But 3 years of distance had changed something important. I no longer confused peacekeeping with love. And I no longer confused guilt with responsibility. I rested my hand on the check presenter, not opening it, just touching it. Dad smiled wider. That's my girl. The words landed strangely, not because they were cruel, because they sounded automatic, like he was speaking to a version of me that no longer existed. I looked up, met his eyes, and smiled politely. Then I turned toward Ethan. The young server immediately appeared beside my chair. Years in restaurants had taught me that servers develop a sixth sense around tension. He'd probably been expecting this moment for the last 30 minutes. Could I speak with you for a second? I asked. Of course. Dad chuckled. No need to be shy, Claire. We all know what's happening. A few relatives laughed. I ignored them. Ethan leaned closer. I lowered my voice. Quietly. Professionally. The same tone I used with staff during busy Friday night shifts. Could you tell me whose card is attached to this reservation? His eyes flickered briefly toward my father, then back to me. The reservation was secured using your father's card. Exactly what I'd expected? Thank you. His expression shifted slightly, like he was beginning to understand. I smiled, then asked a second question. Has that card remained active for the reservation all evening? Yes. Another nod. Another confirmation. Perfect. Dad was still smiling. Still waiting? Still believing he controlled the situation? I finally opened the check presenter. The total was impressive. Several $1,000s. Even by fine dining standards. The combination of premium seafood, imported wine, appetizers, desserts, and a large party had created a bill that could easily cover a month's mortgage payment. A few years earlier, seeing that number might have triggered panic. Not now. Now it simply felt informative, like reading a weather report. Interesting, but not my storm. Dad glanced at the total, then at me. You've done well for yourself. There it was. The justification, the explanation, the reason they believed this was acceptable. Not because I had agreed, because they believed I could afford it, as though ability automatically created obligation. I closed the presenter calmly, carefully. Then I looked around the table, at my relatives, at the people who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, at the people currently enjoying expensive food, purchased under assumptions nobody had bothered to discuss. And suddenly I felt something unexpected. Sadness. Not anger, not resentment, sadness. Because this could have been different. If they'd called, if they'd apologized, if they'd simply said they missed me, I probably would have come anyway. Maybe not to pay for dinner, but to reconnect, to listen, to heal. Instead, they'd chosen manipulation. Again, the same old strategy wrapped in a prettier package. Dad cleared his throat. Well, the room grew quiet. Everyone waiting, everyone expecting. I smiled, then turned back toward Ethan. Could you do me a favor? Certainly. Please continue processing the reservation exactly as it was originally arranged. For a second, Ethan froze. Then understanding flashed across his face. A tiny spark. Professional recognition. He knew exactly what I was saying, and exactly what I wasn't saying. His eyes moved briefly toward my father. Then he nodded. Absolutely. Dad frowned. What does that mean? Ethan remained perfectly professional. It means the reservation will be completed using the payment method currently attached to the booking. Silence. Complete silence. The words took a few seconds to travel around the table. Then reality arrived. My father's smile disappeared first. Mom's expression changed next. Emily slowly lowered her wine glass. Aunt Susan blinked. Twice. Dad sat forward. What? Ethan maintained his professional posture. The reservation was secured using your credit card, sir. Dad stared. The color began draining from his face. But she's paying. His voice sounded less certain now. Less confident. More hopeful. Ethan glanced toward me, then back toward him. I'm sorry, sir. No alternative payment instructions were provided. The room became painfully quiet. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smiled. Because suddenly everyone understood. There had never been an agreement. There had only been an assumption. And assumptions are dangerous things, especially expensive assumptions. Dad looked at me. Claire. Just my name, nothing else. I met his gaze calmly. You never asked. The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. Simple, undeniable, true. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. But you invited me to dinner? I kept my voice gentle, not angry, not loud, just honest. You never asked me to host dinner. Nobody spoke. The distinction was impossible to argue with. Mom finally found her voice. We thought. I nodded. I know. And that was the problem. They thought. They assumed. They expected, but they never asked. For years, they'd built entire relationships around expectations. Nobody bothered to discuss openly. Tonight, that habit had finally reached its limit. Dad grabbed the check presenter. His hands moved faster now. Less confident, more anxious. The total seemed larger the second time he saw it. Across the table, relatives suddenly became fascinated by their coffee cups, their phones, the tablecloth, anywhere except the bill. Funny how quickly shared celebrations become private responsibilities. Ethan stood quietly waiting, professional, patient, giving everyone space to absorb reality. I looked at him and remembered being 19 years old, working impossible shifts, managing difficult tables, trying to remain polite while adults created problems they expected others to solve. The kid had handled the entire evening flawlessly, and for the first time that night, I genuinely smiled, because regardless of what happened next, one thing was finally different. The burden wasn't automatically mine anymore, and everyone at the table had just learned it, the hard way. The silence stretched across the table, not the comfortable kind, not the kind families share during a good meal. This was the silence that arrives when reality suddenly enters a room full of assumptions. My father stared at the bill, then at me, then back at the bill again, as if looking twice might somehow reduce the total. Nobody seemed eager to speak anymore. The cheerful atmosphere that had filled the private dining room 20 minutes earlier had vanished completely. The wine glasses remained half full. The dessert sat unfinished. And every relative who had enthusiastically ordered the most expensive items on the menu suddenly looked much less hungry. Dad cleared his throat. Well, No one responded. Another pause. Longer this time. Then he pulled his wallet out and extracted the same credit card he had been proudly displaying all evening. The card that had secured the reservation. The card attached to the table. The card he clearly believed would never actually be charged. He handed it to Ethan. Run it. His tone carried forced confidence, the kind people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as everyone else. Ethan nodded professionally and disappeared toward the register. The moment he left, conversation erupted. Not loud, not chaotic, just nervous, uneasy, like passengers realizing their flight might not be departing on time. Aunt Susan forced a laugh. Well, this is awkward. Nobody joined her. Emily stared at her phone. Mom adjusted her napkin 3 different times. Uncle Robert suddenly became very interested in the dessert menu. It was remarkable how quickly enthusiasm disappeared when responsibility entered the conversation. I sat quietly, sipping sparkling water, watching, waiting. Years in restaurant management had taught me something valuable. People reveal their true priorities when money becomes involved. 10 minutes ago, everyone had been talking about family. Now, nobody wanted to discuss splitting the bill. A few moments later, Ethan returned. His expression remained perfectly professional, but I could immediately tell something had happened. He approached my father carefully, lowered his voice, and said words that somehow managed to reach every person at the table anyway. I'm sorry, sir. Dad frowned. The card was declined. Silence. Then absolute silence. A silence so complete, I could hear silverware clinking from another section of the restaurant. Dad blinked. What? Ethan remained calm. The transaction wasn't approved. My father looked stunned, genuinely stunned, as though the possibility had never occurred to him. He grabbed the card, turned it over, checked it, then looked at Ethan. Try again. Of course. Ethan accepted the card and returned to the register. Around the table, relatives avoided eye contact. Mom looked embarrassed. Emily suddenly seemed fascinated by something on her screen. Nobody volunteered another card. Nobody offered assistance. Nobody suggested contributing. Interesting. Very interesting. Because according to tonight's repeated speeches, family took care of family. Apparently that principle had limits. A few minutes later, Ethan returned. Same expression. Same careful posture. Same answer. I'm sorry, sir. It was declined again. This time nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My father slowly leaned back into his chair. The confidence he'd worn all evening was gone. Completely gone. And for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar on his face. Uncertainty. The table remained frozen. Then Aunt Susan finally broke. Maybe everyone should help a little. A remarkable suggestion, especially from someone who hadn't offered 5 minutes earlier. Suddenly wallets appeared. Phones emerged. People began calculating, splitting, estimating. The same relatives who had ordered freely, under the assumption that someone else would pay now, became very interested in individual responsibility. The transformation was almost educational. One cousin quietly asked how much her portion would be. Another wondered whether alcohol could be separated. Someone else pointed out they had only eaten an appetizer. Funny how quickly accountability becomes important when the bill arrives. I watched the entire thing unfold without saying a word. Not because I enjoyed their discomfort, because I was finally seeing the truth clearly. For years, I thought my role in the family was generosity, support, loyalty, but sitting there, watching 15 adults scramble to avoid paying for choices they'd happily made an hour earlier, I realized something. I had never been treated like a daughter, or a sister, or even a relative. I had been treated like a solution, a resource, a safety net. And safety nets only get noticed when people expect to fall. Mom finally looked at me, her eyes softer than before, less strategic, more human. Claire, I met her gaze. She hesitated, then stopped. For a moment, she seemed unsure what to say. Maybe because there wasn't a script for this part. No prepared speech. No guilt. No family slogan. Just consequences. Dad rubbed his forehead. The energy had completely drained from him. How did you know? The question surprised me. I tilted my head. Know what? That we expected you to pay. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. I almost smiled. Because the answer was simple. I manage restaurants. Everyone looked at me. I continued. You invited me to a restaurant. I gestured around the table. 16 guests. Then toward the empty wine bottles. The most expensive items on the menu. Toward my father, and a man who spent my entire childhood comparing grocery prices, suddenly ordering premium wine. Nobody spoke. Because every observation was accurate. Every detail had been obvious. At least to someone who understood restaurants. I knew before I sat down. The words landed gently, not as an accusation, as a fact. Dad stared at the table. Mom looked away. Emily finally lowered her phone. And for the first time all evening, nobody argued. Because deep down they knew. The dinner had never been about reconnecting. It had never been about healing. It had never been about repairing a family. It had been about access. Access to the one person they believed would solve the problem. The same person they'd ignored for 3 years. The same person they'd excluded. The same person they expected to quietly rescue them one more time. Only this time, something had changed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was simply finished carrying responsibilities that belonged to other people. Eventually, everyone contributed. Some reluctantly, some generously, some after a great deal of discussion. But by the end of the evening, every dollar had been accounted for by the people who actually ordered the meal. A surprisingly fair arrangement. As guests slowly began leaving, the mood remained subdued. No dramatic arguments, no shouting, just a quiet recognition that something important had shifted. The old pattern had broken, and everyone knew it, including me. As I stood to leave, I looked at the table one final time. At the relatives, at the unfinished wine, at the evening they thought would end very differently. Then I picked up my purse, smiled politely, and prepared to walk away. For the first time in my life, without paying for everyone else, people started leaving in small groups. Not quickly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way guests leave a wedding reception after the music ends. Chairs scraped against the floor. Coats were collected. Half-hearted goodbyes floated through the air. Nobody seemed eager to revisit the evening's events. The celebration atmosphere was gone. In its place was something more honest. Reflection. Reality. One by one, relatives made their way toward the exit. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered polite smiles. A few even stopped to say goodbye. The strange thing was that nobody looked angry. Embarrassed, maybe? Uncomfortable, certainly. But not angry. Because deep down, they all understood what had happened. The bill hadn't become unfair. It had simply landed where it belonged. I thanked Ethan before leaving. The young server looked exhausted, but he smiled. A genuine smile. Have a good night. You too, I said. And you handled that perfectly. His face brightened. For a moment, he looked exactly like every hardworking restaurant kid I'd ever managed. Proud, relieved, seen. Then I walked toward the parking lot. The cool evening air felt refreshing after hours inside the crowded dining room. I took a deep breath. The tension I'd carried into the restaurant was finally fading. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I had finally stopped carrying something that was never mine. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. Claire. I turned. My mother stood a few yards away, alone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The parking lot lights cast soft pools of yellow across the pavement. Cars started, doors closed. Families headed home, but we remained standing there, mother and daughter, separated by 3 years and 1,000 unspoken things. I was hoping you'd wait a minute. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain. I nodded. She walked closer, not too close, just enough. For a few seconds, she stared toward the restaurant entrance. Then she sighed. You were right. The words caught me off guard, not because I'd never imagined hearing them, because I'd stopped expecting to. I know that doesn't fix anything, she continued, but you were right. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. For once, without rushing to rescue the conversation, without trying to make things easier, she folded her arms against the cool night air. When your sister wanted that loan, I thought family loyalty was more important than caution. A sad smile crossed her face. The truth is, I was scared. I listened. The bakery failed exactly the way you said it might. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only honesty. Your father and I spent years convincing ourselves that if you'd just helped, things would have worked out differently. She looked down. They wouldn't have. The admission seemed difficult, like something she'd been carrying for a long time. We blamed you because it was easier than admitting we made mistakes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at my mother, really looked at her. The lines around her eyes, the tiredness she couldn't quite hide. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the villain I'd imagined during countless sleepless nights. She was simply flawed, human, and finally willing to admit it. A tear formed in the corner of her eye. She brushed it away quickly. You know what I missed most? The question surprised me. What? She smiled sadly. Sunday phone calls. My throat tightened unexpectedly, because I missed those too. Not every conversation, not every disagreement, Just the simple moments. The ordinary ones. The moments families never appreciate until they're gone. Mom laughed softly. I kept waiting for you to call. I almost smiled. I kept waiting for you. Her laugh turned into a small shake of her head. Well. For the first time all evening, the conversation felt real. No audience. No speeches. No expectations. Just honesty. She glanced toward the restaurant. Your father probably won't admit it tonight. I raised an eyebrow. But he's embarrassed. That didn't surprise me. He's also been asking about you for months. That surprised me. Mom noticed. He won't say it directly. A small smile appeared. He's stubborn. That trait sounds familiar. She laughed. A real laugh this time. The kind I remembered from childhood. For a second, I heard echoes of the mother who taught me to bake cornbread while old country songs played in the kitchen. The memory warmed something inside me. Neither of us mentioned forgiveness. Neither of us pretended everything was fixed. Some wounds need time. Some conversations require more than one evening. But for the first time in years, there was a bridge where a wall used to be. A small bridge. Fragile. Incomplete. But real. Mom stepped forward and hugged me. Carefully. As if she wasn't sure whether she still had permission. After a brief hesitation, I hugged her back. The embrace wasn't magical. It didn't erase 3 years. It didn't rewrite history. But it mattered. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a grand moment. Sometimes it arrives as two people deciding to stop walking in opposite directions. When we finally stepped apart, Mom smiled. Maybe coffee sometime? Not dinner. Not a family gathering. Not an event. Just coffee. Simple. Manageable. Honest. I'd expected manipulation. Instead, I heard hope, and after a moment, I nodded. I'd like that. Her smile widened. The genuine kind. Then she headed toward her car. I watched her leave, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt lighter. Not because I had won, not because anyone had lost, but because I had finally learned something important. Love and responsibility are not the same thing. Helping people is beautiful. Rescuing people from the consequences of their choices is not. Real family isn't built on guilt. It isn't built on obligation. And it certainly isn't built on a credit card. It's built on respect, honesty, boundaries, and showing up for each other without keeping score. I climbed into my car. The sticky note was still attached to the dashboard. One dinner, then home. I smiled, started the engine, and drove into the night carrying something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, my dignity and my kindness were finally walking side by side. And that made all the difference.